Chapter 1. The Tolling That Never Stopped. It began, quite fittingly, with a bell. Not the clear sweet ring of celebration, nor the mournful toll of mourning, but something altogether stranger. A sound that hovered somewhere between memory and present, a resonance so low it seemed not to vibrate the air but the very bones of those who heard it. The setting was the small Wiltshire village of Stoke Lavelle, nestled amidst green knolls and creeping ivy. At its heart stood the crumbling edifice of the Cavendish Bell Foundry, once the pride of England, now little more than a half-forgotten relic. Generations of Cavendishes had cast bronze into voice here, shipping bells to distant cathedrals, steeples and ships. But time, as always, had its toll. The foundry had been closed for years, its great furnaces cold, its workshops hollow. Until now. Lady Viola Cavendish, last of the line, had recently returned from her self-imposed exile on the continent. Rumours swirled like chimney smoke, of debts, of disgrace, of some mysterious breakdown abroad. But it was her intention to restore the foundry that truly caught the public's attention. With her return came a flurry of letters, invitations and appointments, wealthy investors, curious historians, and one famous detective, for she had personally requested the presence of none other than Hercule Poirot. The reason for this summons was not clear, at least not at first. The gathering took place on a mist-clad Tuesday in early autumn. A private tour of the foundry had been arranged, followed by an elegant dinner at the Cavendish estate. The air held that coppery crispness unique to English countryside evenings, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Among the assembled guests were several notable figures. There was Edmund Swithinbank, a polished industrialist and long-time admirer of Lady Viola, perhaps too long. He had once courted her before she disappeared to Paris, and now, in her return, saw not only a chance at reconciliation, but profit. Next came Miss Jocasta Vale, a young archaeologist of some repute. Her recent studies in metallurgy and historical forensics had brought her to the Cavendish archives. Her appearance here was more academic than social, though she seemed far too composed for someone her age. And there was Colonel Ambrose Harkness, retired, straight-backed, with sharp grey eyes and a walking stick that could surely kill a man if wielded with intent. A cousin of the Cavendishes, his family ties seemed tinged with disdain rather than warmth. Then, of course, Lady Viola herself. Dressed in black velvet with a blood-red brooch at her throat, she carried herself like an empress amid ruins. Her face bore the patina of sorrow, and her voice was low and musical, yet something brittle seemed to lie just beneath it. She greeted Poirot with a hesitant warmth, and immediately insisted they speak privately after the tour. As for Poirot, he was as meticulous as ever. His moustaches were waxed to symmetrical perfection. His eyes, bright and unreadable, missed nothing. Not the faint tremble of Viola's fingers, not the way Edmund avoided Jocasta's gaze, nor the fact that Colonel Harkness seemed overly interested in the cracked floor tiles leading into the mould vaults. The group entered the foundry just as the sun began its descent, golden beams filtering through soot-stained windows. Dust danced in the shafts of light like restless spirits. The guide, a local man named Davies, spoke of the history with more reverence than precision. Then, as they approached the casting chamber, an immense space lined with rusting tools and massive crucibles, it happened. A bell tolled. But not one of the ceremonial bells arranged on pedestals. No, this was deep and dissonant, as though summoned from the earth itself. The sound reverberated through stone and skin, and everyone stopped. "That's impossible," whispered Davis. "There are no bells hanging here anymore. They've all been dismantled." The sound faded, but not the unease. Lady Viola staggered slightly, her face drained of colour. I heard it last night too. I thought—" Poirot placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Courage, madame. It is perhaps not so impossible as it seems." Before anything more could be said, a scream echoed from deeper within the foundry. They rushed to the rear chamber, the mould room, where the scent of charred wood and old brass was strongest. There, crumpled beneath a collapsed rack of casting moulds, lay the body of young Thomas Cavendish, Lady Viola's distant nephew and apprentice. His neck was twisted at a violent angle. Death had come instantly. Lady Viola let out a strangled sob, but Poirot was already on one knee, his fingers hovering above the body but not touching. His eyes traced the line of soot on Thomas's boots, the peculiar angle of a nearby ladder, and a faint smear of what looked like grease across the floor. Colonel Harkness muttered, "Poor lad must have climbed where he shouldn't." "Perhaps," murmured Poirot. "Or perhaps he saw something he was not meant to see." No one responded. The room had grown suddenly colder. Poirot stood slowly and surveyed the dark recesses of the Foundry. He said nothing more, but in the sharp glint of his eyes, the game had already begun. Somewhere within these ancient walls, forged in secrecy and long-forgotten rivalries, a crime had occurred, one that only Hercule Poirot and his little grey cells could hope to unravel. Chapter 2. The Echo in the Dust. The police arrived just past 8 o'clock, summoned hastily by Davies, who'd stumbled outside in a daze after Thomas's body was discovered. The village constable, a ruddy-faced man named Inspector Rigby, took immediate control of the scene, or at least he attempted to. Poirot, with a courteous incline of the head, made it clear he was not merely a bystander. His name alone sufficed to earn a respectful distance from Rigby, who was quickly out of his depth. "The young man fell, it appears," Rigby said as he peered over the body, frowning at the jumbled pile of moulds that had collapsed onto the lad. "Climbing where he oughtn't to be, perhaps. Reckless sort of thing." Poirot, kneeling beside the crumpled figure once more, did not look up. "Oui, Inspector, but may I offer a gentle observation? A man who climbs carelessly usually lands in chaos. This," he gestured delicately, "this is too tidy." Indeed, the pile of moulds lay heavily but evenly, suggesting not a chaotic fall but a deliberate arrangement. Thomas's limbs were splayed unnaturally, but the ladder nearby remained upright, perfectly stable. Rigby scratched his head. "You think it was deliberate? Sabotage?" Poirot stood, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel. "Let us not jump to conclusions. First we observe. We always begin with the facts." Lady Viola, who had been silent since the scream, now approached from the archway. She looked pale but composed, her voice cool. "Thomas had no enemies. He worked in the archives. He was gentle, devoted to the family. This must be a dreadful accident." Poirot turned to her gently. "Pardon, madame, but sometimes it is those with no enemies who are most vulnerable. They trust too easily, do they not?" Her eyes flickered for a moment, some emotion tightly caged. "Are you suggesting he was murdered?" "I suggest nothing yet," Poirot said calmly. "I merely ask questions and listen to what is not said." The Foundry was cordoned off, and Rigby took perfunctory statements. The remaining guests were led back to the estate. Poirot, however, lingered behind. He moved slowly through the casting chamber again, his shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He paused before the enormous crucible, its surface still stained with bronze and soot. Then his gaze shifted upward, to the rafters where chains and pulleys hung, still gently swaying. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small notebook, writing something swiftly, then snapping it shut. Back at the Cavendish estate, the atmosphere was muted and tense. The guests had been gathered into the drawing room, the fire lit despite the mildness of the evening. Conversations were stilted, every glance tight with unspoken speculation. Edmund Swithinbank paced by the window, his brow furrowed in what might have been concern or calculation. "A tragedy, truly," he muttered. "But the Foundry, this will ruin Lady Viola's plans. Investors will flee. There will be talk." Colonel Harkness scoffed, seated rigidly in an armchair. "Talk is cheap. The boy should have known better than to wander unsupervised in a death trap like that." Jocasta Vale, perched on a settee, looked up from a worn sketchbook she had been absent-mindedly thumbing. "He wasn't wandering," she said softly. "He was cataloguing the mould designs. I saw him there just yesterday, copying. Down dimensions." Poirot entered just then, the scent of cold iron and chalk clinging to him. "Mademoiselle, you say he was working in the Foundry frequently?" Jocasta nodded. "He said he was creating a master index for the archive. It was his own initiative. He was very thorough." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "It is often the thorough ones who discover things they are not meant to." "Are you implying Thomas found something?" Edmund asked, his voice sharp. Poirot offered a faint smile. "I imply nothing, monsieur, but I ask myself, why does a man who spends his time among papers and records end his life beneath cast-iron moulds?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like the toll of an unseen bell. Poirot took a seat by the fire, crossing his legs carefully. "I wonder," he said aloud to no one in particular, "if any of you heard the bell." The room stilled. Jocasta blinked. "You mean the tolling sound? I thought it was a trick of the acoustics," Edmund frowned. "Yes, it sounded faint, almost subterranean. But there are no active bells, are there?" "Non," Poirot said. "And yet we heard it. So either a ghost has returned to ring the past back into the present, or someone wishes us to believe it has." Lady Viola entered quietly at that moment, her dress now changed to a more muted grey. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "may I speak with you, in the study?" Poirot rose. "Mais oui." They passed down the corridor lined with ancestral portraits, stern Cavendish men and melancholic women. The study was warm, paper-scented, with heavy drapes drawn against the night. Viola sat behind her father's old desk. "I must confess something," she said, voice lowered. "The bell sounds... I didn't just hear it last night. I've heard it every night since I returned, always around twilight. It's never quite the same, but always there." Poirot studied her with careful sympathy. "And you did not tell anyone?" She shook her head. "They would say it is grief, or nerves, but I swear to you it is real." "Real or not," Poirot said softly, "it has stirred something, and tonight it has cost a life." He stood, looking toward the dark window beyond. Somewhere, far in the distance, a single echo seemed to resonate through the hills, just at the edge of hearing. A tolling, faint as breath. The Foundry was working again. Chapter 3. Shadows Beneath Bronze. The next morning arrived not with birdsong but with rain. A gentle, persistent drizzle hung in the air like breath on cold glass. The Foundry loomed in the grey light, its spires and chimneys blackened by decades of soot. Water trickled down the oxidized bronze plaque at its entrance, where the Cavendish name was barely legible. Poirot stood at the edge of the property with his coat buttoned to the throat and a green umbrella resting lightly on one shoulder. He regarded the building in silence, eyes narrowed. At his side, Inspector Rigby waited with visible discomfort. "I'm just saying, Mr. Poirot," Rigby offered with a stiff shrug. "The death looks accidental. No signs of forced entry, no blunt trauma apart from the fall. Tragic, yes, but not exactly foul play." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "And yet, monsieur, if one has eyes only for what is obvious, one sees nothing at all. Let us consider. Why was Monsieur Thomas in that particular room at that particular time? And why did the bell sound before his death?" Rigby grunted. "You believe someone lured him?" "I do not yet know what I believe," Poirot said quietly, "but someone else does. Of that I am certain." They entered the Foundry again, passing through the casting chamber toward the mould vault, where the accident had occurred. The scene had been tidied, the body removed, but the sense of unease remained. Poirot moved through the space with deliberate care, pausing to examine a set of scuff marks near the base of the wall. Rigby watched him uncertainly. "Do you make anything of that?" "These," Poirot said, gesturing to the faint lines, "are fresh. And note, there are 2 sets. One of the shoes, yes, but also the marks on the knees. Someone knelt here, recently, perhaps last night." He rose and turned his gaze to the rusted chains above. "This, I think, was not the site of an accident, but a stage for a performance." Poirot's eyes then drifted to a metal cabinet tucked behind a half-collapsed workbench. He approached it, inspecting the lock. It was old, but recently oiled. He took a delicate step back. "Monsieur Rigby," he said, "with your permission, might we open this cabinet?" Rigby nodded, fetched a crowbar from the corner, and with a grunt of effort, forced the rusted hinges open. Inside lay a collection of aged, leather-bound ledgers, accounts, schematics, and shipping logs, decades old, though some bore more recent notes in a different hand. Poirot pulled out one of the ledgers, its cover stamped 1909. Flipping carefully through, he paused at a dog-eared page. His brow furrowed. "What is it?" Rigby asked. Poirot did not answer at once. He turned another page, then a third, then closed the book with a soft thud. "There is something missing, a pattern that breaks, an inconsistency." "Missing entries?" Rigby offered. "No," Poirot said. "Entries that are too perfect, as if someone attempted to cover a past error by recreating an earlier structure, but with too much symmetry. People do not live such neat lives, especially not those dealing in copper, contracts and complications. He turned, his gaze alighting on the dust-covered casting bell on the far pedestal. Come, I wish to hear again what this place sounds like when it rings. Back at the estate, the atmosphere had not improved. The guests remained confined, ostensibly for their safety. But Poirot knew the true reason. Suspicion had begun to creep in, silent as ivy. Lady Viola was seated in the library with a cup of untouched tea. Her fingers fidgeted with a silver letter opener as Poirot entered. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, without looking up, "have you found anything to suggest Thomas's death was more than an accident?" Poirot took a seat across from her. "It was not only Thomas who was in danger, madam. He may have simply been the one who disturbed what should have remained hidden." Her hand stilled. He continued gently, "May I ask, who stands to inherit the estate should you meet with misfortune?" She looked up sharply. "You think someone is targeting me?" Poirot held her gaze. "I think someone wishes to silence history, and you, madame, have returned to stir the past." Viola's composure faltered for a moment. "When I was in Paris, I was told not to come back. Anonymous letters, threats. I thought them the ravings of someone bitter over the closure. But now," she trailed off. Poirot leaned forward. "Do you still have these letters?" She hesitated. "I burned them. I thought it best." "Alas," Poirot said, "the best intentions often erase the most important truths." Outside the window, the rain slowed. A single chime sounded from the village church, but the sound that echoed faintly in Poirot's memory was deeper, stranger, older. He rose and bowed. "Merci, madame. I must now speak to your guests again, for the bell that tolls in this mystery has not yet been silenced, and somewhere, just below the surface of polished smiles and practised grief, a truth waited, heavy as bronze, ready to fall." Chapter 4. The Whispering Flame. That evening, the Cavendish estate seemed suspended in a strange hush, as though the rain had washed the air clean but left behind something more unsettling. The rooms were dimly lit, the fire in the drawing-room flickering with a restless energy. Poirot stood by the hearth, his expression unreadable, while the remaining guests loitered about the edges of the room like chess pieces waiting to be moved. Colonel Harkness leaned stiffly on his cane, his pale eyes following Poirot with open suspicion. "If you've something to say, Poirot," he said gruffly, "you might as well say it outright." "Ah," said Poirot lightly, "but that is the trouble with the truth, mon colonel. It must be cooked slowly like a fine dish. Revealed too quickly, it spoils the appetite." Edmund Swithenbank chuckled dryly from the drinks cabinet, where he poured himself a second brandy. "Careful, Poirot. If you speak in too many riddles, you'll convince us you're the culprit." Poirot gave a slight bow. "Mais non, monsieur. I do not possess the motive nor the passion. And passion, I think, is what drives this mystery." Lady Viola entered just then, her figure composed in black silk, her expression distant. "I've spoken with Thomas's solicitor," she said quietly. "There's no doubt. The estate remains with me. But I've also discovered something else, something troubling." Everyone turned toward her. "In one of the file drawers in the study," she continued, "I found a page torn from the Foundry's deed. A page detailing the original bequest conditions. It was wedged behind a cabinet. Someone didn't want it found." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And what did it contain, madame?" She hesitated. "A clause stating that if the Foundry were ever to resume operations, any profits must be divided among all living heirs of the Cavendish family, immediate or extended." A silence followed. Harkness's face tightened. Edmund's glass halted mid-air. Jocasta Vale looked up from her sketchpad, her brow furrowed. "So," Poirot said gently, "reviving the Foundry meant sharing wealth with others, and perhaps one person wished to prevent that, by stopping its revival altogether." "You're implying motive," Edmund said, his voice clipped. "I am merely observing patterns," Poirot replied, "and when the pattern does not wish to be seen, it is often because it leads to an uncomfortable truth." Colonel Harkness let out a harsh breath. "If you think any of us had reason to kill the boy over an inheritance clause, you insult this family." "Forgive me," Poirot said calmly, "but inheritance has driven many a noble soul to ignoble acts." Poirot turned toward Jocasta. "Mademoiselle, earlier you said Thomas was compiling an index. Did he mention discovering anything unusual in the records?" She hesitated. He did say something odd, a few days ago, that some shipment ledgers from the 1930s didn't match the moulds they were associated with. He was troubled. He said it felt like someone had falsified shipments. Poirot raised a brow. Ah, counterfeit entries, perhaps. Or perhaps hidden work under the name of another. Lady Viola looked stricken. If someone had been using the Foundry's name for illicit production, then Thomas may have uncovered it, Poirot said softly, and his death may not be a coincidence. The fire cracked sharply, sending a cascade of embers up the flue. Poirot's gaze remained steady. Tell me, he continued, who was the last person to see Thomas alive before the tour yesterday? There was a pause. Then Jocasta answered slowly. I passed him in the corridor about an hour before the tour. He was going toward the east wing. I assumed he was looking for a particular mould design. He mentioned something called the sapphire pattern. Colonel Harkness stiffened. What did you say? The sapphire pattern, Jocasta repeated. Why? The colonel turned away abruptly. Nothing. Just, I thought it had been lost. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Ah, and yet it seems Thomas had found a trace of it. Perhaps it was not lost, merely hidden. Outside, the wind stirred the trees and the sound of distant chimes drifted faintly across the moors. Poirot turned back to the room. Tomorrow, he said, I would like to see the east wing of the Foundry. I believe it may hold something we have overlooked. Lady Viola nodded, her voice faint. I'll have the doors unlocked. It hasn't been used in decades. Poirot bowed slightly. Merci. Until then, I suggest we each retire early, for the shadows grow longer when the truth draws near. As the guests filed out, Poirot lingered, staring into the flames. Hastings might have found the mood oppressive, and indeed the great detective allowed himself one small sigh. The fire whispered, casting flickers along the walls like spectres of the past. Chapter 5. Into the East Wing. The next morning broke with thin silver light slicing through clouds. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy, saturated with the scent of wet stone and moss. Poirot, dressed with even more precision than usual, stood at the threshold of the east wing of the Cavendish Bell Foundry. Lady Viola arrived moments later with a ring of old brass keys. This part of the foundry was sealed after the war, she said, voice low. My father believed it was cursed. Fires, accidents, some said sabotage. Poirot took the keys delicately. Superstition, madam, is the enemy of reason, but it is a loyal servant to guilt. The lock protested, but turned. The door creaked open, revealing a corridor cloaked in dust and shadows. The air inside was musty, infused with old grease and the dry tang of forgotten chemicals. Their footsteps echoed eerily. Poirot moved with care, touching nothing but seeing everything. Old crates lined the hallway, most stamped with the Cavendish crest. Some faded, others completely blackened with age. Here and there, symbols had been chalked onto the walls, production codes, alchemical notations, dates ranging from the late 1800s to the 1940s. May I ask, madam, Poirot said without looking at her, did the Foundry ever take military contracts? Viola hesitated. During the war? Yes. Shell casings, signal bells for ships. But all records were sealed and stored when the war ended. I never looked at them. Curious, Poirot murmured, that Thomas would choose this of all places to investigate. They reached a door at the far end, marked Archive Room. Viola unlocked it. Inside, shelves stood like solemn sentinels, stacks of ledgers, blueprints, and faded diagrams. And in the centre, a narrow table strewn with Thomas's handwriting. Half a schematic was unfurled, weighted with a bronze casting hammer. Poirot approached the table. A notepad lay open, filled with neat cursive. Sapphire pattern traced to shipment dated 1937. Destination redacted. Signature ECH. He turned to Viola. Do those initials mean anything to you? Her eyes darkened. Elliot Cavendish Harkness, my uncle. He died in 1941, factory explosion. It was ruled accidental. Oui. Convenient, perhaps. Poirot examined the schematic. The sapphire pattern was not decorative. It was structural. A casting framework unlike any bell or ornament. It resembled the inner chamber of a tuned resonator. This was no ceremonial bell, he murmured. It was designed for precision. He turned to the shelves. Permit me a few minutes, madam. Viola stepped back as Poirot scanned the spines of the ledgers. He pulled one thin, red bound labelled Private, ECH. Inside, the entries were dense, coded, but one page, dog-eared and faintly smeared with ink, stood out. Trial successful. Sound resonance amplifies below chamber threshold. Maintain secrecy. V must never know. Poirot's jaw tightened. Viola, they kept this from you. She stepped closer. You think they were building something hidden? I think, he said carefully, that whatever Thomas discovered, he was not the first to look here. They left the East Wing in thoughtful silence. Outside, the world felt quieter, though not calmer. Back at the estate, Poirot found Jocasta Vale in the conservatory, hunched over a bell fragment resting on a silk cloth. She looked up as he entered. I've been analysing the bronze mix, she said without preamble. This fragment was cast using an unusual alloy, vanadium and trace beryllium. It's not typical for ceremonial bells. More like military resonance technology, Poirot finished. She blinked. Yes, exactly. He studied her face. Mademoiselle, do you know of anyone who might have had access to these designs in recent weeks? Anyone aside from Thomas? She hesitated. Well, Edmund came to the archive 2 weeks ago, said he was looking for historical talking points to help market the Foundry's revival, but he spent an awfully long time in the restricted section. Did Thomas know? I don't think so. He wasn't fond of Edmund. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. He returned to the drawing room, where Edmund Swithinbank sat reading the Financial Times with exaggerated calm. Poirot approached, folding his hands behind his back. Monsieur, I must ask, what were you searching for in the archive 2 weeks ago? Edmund looked up coolly. I told Lady Viola, just background material. Ah, but you spent a great deal of time with the ledgers concerning the 1930s. Did you perhaps come across mention of the sapphire pattern? Edmund's fingers tensed. That's nonsense, technical jargon. Poirot smiled faintly, and yet Thomas believed it significant enough to risk entering the sealed East Wing. I'm not responsible for that boy's obsessions, Edmund snapped. He was too curious for his own good. Or perhaps, Poirot said softly, he became too curious for yours. Poirot turned and walked away before Edmund could respond, his mind racing. The pieces were there, half buried in the dust of the past, a design too dangerous for daylight, a ledger too carefully rewritten, and a death that had tipped a long silent bell into motion. The sapphire pattern was not merely a historical anomaly, it was a secret someone had killed to keep. Chapter 6. The tarnish beneath the polished brass. The following afternoon brought a deceptive stillness to Stoke Lavelle. Sunlight danced through the misted windows of the Cavendish estate, casting fractured light across dust-laden portraits and parquet floors. But within, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Poirot sensed it with every passing glance, each fragment of strained politeness exchanged between the remaining guests. The air hummed, not with warmth, but tension. Poirot stood in the hallway just outside the study, his gaze lingering on the grandfather clock. It ticked steadily, evenly, as if indifferent to the events that had unfolded beneath its ever-watchful face. Lady Viola entered from the drawing-room, her expression tight. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I've received word from the solicitor. Thomas had recently altered his will. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Oh? Yes, she continued, lowering her voice. He left a portion of his personal archive, his notes, findings, all of it, to Miss Jocasta Vale. Poirot folded his arms slowly. That is intriguing. He admired her, Viola said softly. I believe he confided in her more than in me. Poirot gave a slow nod. Mademoiselle Jocasta is intelligent, observant, but perhaps she's not the only one who was close to him. From the drawing-room came the sound of glass clinking. Poirot turned to see Edmund Swithinbank helping himself once again to the drinks cabinet. The man seemed slightly more dishevelled than before, his cravat askew, his hand lingering too long on the decanter. Nearby, Colonel Harkness sat with grim military posture, arms folded across his chest, eyes sharp. Poirot entered. Ah, he said lightly, I see we are all gathered once again. Edmund scoffed. Might as well be. No one's allowed to leave until your mystery is solved, is that it? Poirot smiled. Not quite. You're free to leave, of course, monsieur, but one must always consider what they leave behind. Colonel Harkness leaned forward. If you've got something to say, Poirot, say it. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the fire. Tell me, Colonel, did you serve during the war in procurement or engineering? Harkness frowned. Engineering, subauditory systems, naval sound detection. Why? Because, Poirot said, still staring at the flames, the sapphire pattern would have been of great interest to someone with your expertise. A tuned resonator chamber, built with non-ferrous alloy, capable of delivering signal pulses below standard detection thresholds, a wartime innovation, but also one easily misused. The Colonel's jaw flexed. That project was classified. Indeed, and conveniently. Buried, Poirot said, but not forgotten. Edmund stepped in, voice sharper. What does any of that have to do with Thomas? Poirot turned to him. Everything. He found the plans, understood what they were. He was preparing to expose them, perhaps even publish an article, and you, both of you, had reasons to stop him. Financial, reputational, perhaps even patriotic. Lady Viola entered, alarmed. You think Colonel Harkness? Poirot raised a calming hand. I do not accuse. I merely observe. The Colonel's familiarity with the design, Monsieur Swithinbank's interest in the archives, and Mademoiselle Vale, the unexpected heir to Thomas's intellectual estate. Jocasta, who had just arrived in the doorway, flinched. What are you implying? Poirot approached her gently. Mademoiselle, did you know of Thomas's will? She hesitated. No, I swear it. Poirot nodded slowly. You believe he trusted you? Yes. Poirot's tone softened. Then tell me truly. What was the last thing Thomas said to you? Jocasta glanced at Viola, then back at Poirot. He said he thought someone was reading his notes, that pages had been moved, marked. He didn't know who. He said he was going to lock them in the mould vault after dinner. Poirot's gaze sharpened. After dinner? That was before the tour? Yes. Poirot turned away, thoughtful. Then he never had the chance, or he was intercepted. There was a long silence. Finally, Poirot spoke again. I must ask one more thing. Where were each of you 15 minutes before the Foundry tour began? Lady Viola answered first. I was dressing. Davies saw me. He brought in fresh linen. Edmund nodded slowly. I was on a call, in the study. Viola can confirm. She passed me. Colonel Harkness said, I was walking in the orchard, alone. Poirot turned to Jocasta. I was in the archive, she said, reading the shipment ledgers. Poirot gave a slight bow. Merci. Then, as if the conversation had been no more than a polite inquiry, he withdrew. Outside, the sky was turning an iron grey again. Poirot stepped onto the terrace, hands behind his back. His mind churned through the fragments. The page torn from the deed, the silent bell, the missing schematic, the sound that should not have rung. Someone here was not merely hiding a crime, they were hiding themselves, beneath charm or rigidity, beneath sorrow or scholarship, and Poirot intended to find out who. Chapter 7. A Game of Tones and Lies. That night, Poirot dined alone. He had declined Lady Viola's invitation to join the others in the dining room, preferring instead a light supper brought to him in the library. The rain had returned in faint rhythmic pulses against the windows, and he welcomed the quiet. He needed solitude, not for rest, but for thought. On the table before him were Thomas's notes, the red-bound ledger marked private. Ek, and a half-burned fragment of parchment that Viola had discovered earlier that day tucked behind the study fireplace. A schematic drawn in smudged charcoal, labelled Sapphire Pattern, Revision 4. It was only partially legible, but Poirot's trained eye noted the subtle adjustments to resonance chambers, no longer military grade, but tuned to a lower frequency. Subauditory. Possibly destructive. Mon Dieu, he murmured, not a bell for sound, a bell for silence. Just then, the door creaked open. Jocasta Vale stood in the doorway hesitant. I'm sorry, she said. I saw the light and thought you might still be working. Poirot gestured to the armchair across from him. Come, mademoiselle. You look troubled. She stepped inside, clutching her coat close. I can't stop thinking about what you said earlier, about Thomas, about who might have been watching him. Oui, Poirot said gently. You were close to him. She nodded. He was kind, curious. He didn't think like others, always chasing puzzles, even when it meant offending someone. Edmund warned him to keep quiet. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Ah? He told Thomas not to interfere with business he couldn't understand. I overheard them arguing last week. Thomas said something about covering up history. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Did you tell anyone? No, I didn't want to make it worse. And now... She looked down. I wonder if staying silent made me complicit. Mademoiselle, Poirot said softly, in silence there is sometimes wisdom, but sometimes regret. She looked up at him. You think I'm hiding something? I think, he said carefully, that you are afraid of what you know and of what it might mean. She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward the ledger on the desk. That book, she whispered. I saw Edmund carrying it last week. He said it was just a family keepsake. Poirot followed her gaze. You are certain? I'm sure. He was in the East Wing. He had keys. Poirot's fingers closed around the leather cover. Then we have a puzzle piece. Placed in the wrong hands. Jocasta stood. I should go. I don't want the others to think I'm trying to influence your investigation. Poirot nodded. Bonne nuit, mademoiselle. After she left, Poirot remained seated for several long minutes. Then, rising, he crossed to the bookshelf beside the fireplace. He ran a finger along the spines until he came to a collection of bound Foundry reports. Volume 6 was missing. He returned to the desk, opened the ledger again, and found the reference repeated in the margins. Cross-check Volume 6, 1937-39, a gap in the archive. Convenient. With deliberate care, Poirot tucked the ledger under his arm and left the library. He found Edmund Swithinbank smoking in the garden alcove, half sheltered from the rain, staring into the darkness with a distant frown. Bonsoir, monsieur, Poirot said smoothly. Edmund exhaled smoke. You work late. The truth, monsieur, Poirot said mildly, does not follow office hours. Edmund's gaze flicked to the ledger. Still leafing through the family's sins? Poirot smiled. You know this volume well, do you not? Hard not to, Edmund said evenly. Elliot Cavendish Harkness wrote most of it. Obsessive, if you ask me. Every page has a code. Codes, Poirot echoed, are often meant to conceal guilt. Edmund stubbed out the cigarette. You've got a theory, Poirot. Let's hear it. Poirot tilted his head. I believe Thomas stumbled upon something bigger than the inheritance or rivalry. I believe he found the true purpose behind the sapphire pattern, and someone feared what would happen if that purpose became known. And you think that someone is me? Edmund asked, tone sharp now. I think you had an opportunity, Poirot said calmly, and perhaps more motive than you admit. Edmund stood. You'd better be careful with accusations, Poirot. This isn't a parlour game. Poirot's gaze did not waver. No, monsieur, it is a bell, and when struck, truth resonates. He turned and walked back inside, leaving Edmund alone with the storm. Upstairs, a window creaked open. Somewhere, a hinge gave a soft metallic whine, and faintly, like a memory brought back by fog, the low sound of a bell hummed again in the night air. No one rang it, no one dared, but it rang all the same. Chapter 8. The Second Silence. The morning after the bell's uncanny tolling, the household was subdued. A strange heaviness lingered in the air, as if the house itself had taken a breath it could not quite exhale. Poirot noted it at once. The servants moved with unusually quiet steps, eyes darting toward the windows, as though expecting a shadow to appear there unbidden. At breakfast, only Lady Viola and Colonel Harkness were present. Edmund and Jocasta were absent. Viola sipped her tea with pale fingers, while the Colonel methodically buttered his toast, his every motion precise. Poirot entered a few moments later, his manner unusually solemn. I trust you both slept well, he asked with a slight bow. Viola smiled weakly. As well as one can. The storm returned in the night, did it not? Poirot nodded, and with it, a sound we cannot ignore. The Colonel grunted. I heard it. The damn bell again. Can't be wind. Too deliberate. Poirot took his seat, folding his napkin neatly. Indeed, a resonance without origin, or so it would seem. Viola looked up, brow furrowed. You think someone is playing a recording? Poirot smiled faintly. If so, they have gone to great lengths to ensure perfect atmospheric alignment. No, madame, I believe the sound is real. But what we must ask ourselves is, who benefits from its return? Colonel Harkness scowled. You think it's some kind of manipulation? Psychological? Warfare? Possibly, Poirot replied. More likely it is meant to remind us of something, a warning or an invitation. At that moment a maid appeared, breathless. Sir, madam, please, something's happened. Miss Vale, she's collapsed. Poirot was on his feet instantly. Where? In the archive room. She was with Mr. Swithinbank. He sent for help. They rushed through the corridors to the west wing, where Jocasta Vale lay on the floor beside an open chest of documents. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. Edmund knelt beside her, visibly shaken. She just fainted, he said, looking up. We were examining old materials. I didn't even touch her. She gasped and went down like a puppet with its strings cut. Poirot knelt beside her and gently checked her pulse. It fluttered, weak but steady. He leaned closer and caught a faint chemical odour, metallic, acrid. Colonel, he said sharply, smell the air. Harkness inhaled and grimaced. Chloropecrine, maybe? Industrial irritant. Gas from old shells, sometimes used in sabotage. Could have leaked from a rusted container. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Or been placed deliberately. Lady Viola stood trembling. Is she? She will recover, Poirot said, but she must rest, and we must ask. Why would someone attempt to silence her now? Edmund straightened, his face taut. You think this was intentional? Poirot stood, eyes on him. Did Miss Vale say anything before she collapsed? Edmund hesitated. Only that she found something. A letter. It was folded inside one of the ledgers. Poirot gestured. Where is it? Edmund stepped back, pointing to the open chest. There. Poirot retrieved the envelope carefully, his gloved fingers brushing away dust. It was addressed in a looping hand. To be opened only upon my death. E.C.H. He unfolded it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible. Poirot read aloud. If the project is ever uncovered, deny everything. They will not understand. It was not meant for war. It was meant for preservation. Sound preserves memory. The bell holds voices, not just resonance, but remembrance. A hush followed. Colonel Harkness exhaled sharply. Madness. He thought he was building a memory machine. Poirot tapped the letter lightly. Or perhaps he was. The sapphire pattern was more than engineering. It was an ideology, a way to contain what time erases. Lady Viola whispered, and Thomas found it. Poirot nodded. We, and now, Miss Vale has too. He turned to Edmund. You were there when she collapsed. You retrieved the letter. You must understand how this appears. Edmund bristled. I didn't harm her. I swear it. Then prove it, Poirot said softly. Tell us what she found before she could. Edmund hesitated, then shook his head. I didn't see it. I barely glanced at the folder. I was reaching for the next, one when she fell. Poirot studied him for a long moment. You're an excellent businessman, Monsieur Swithinbank, but even the best actors betray themselves. Eventually. Poirot rose and turned to Viola. She must be kept under watch. No more lone research. I fear we are nearing the end, and someone is growing desperate. As Jocasta was carried upstairs by the doctor, Poirot stood at the threshold of the archive room and looked back at the shelves. Each volume a voice, each ledger is silent, and somewhere among them the final note was waiting to be struck. Chapter 9. The Voice, Locked in Iron. That evening, as the wind whispered through the broken slats of the Foundry shutters, Poirot sat alone in the conservatory. The glass panes trembled with each gust, casting flickers of lamplight across his reflection. In his lap sat the mysterious letter from Elliot Cavendish Harkness. He read it again, slowly, as if willing the faded ink to surrender a hidden meaning. Sound preserves memory, not just resonance, but remembrance. Poirot tapped a finger against the glass table. Remembrance, he murmured, but of what, and for whom? His thoughts were interrupted by Lady Viola's soft entrance. She looked pale but composed, a glass of water trembling slightly in her grasp. I've just spoken to the doctor, she said. Jocasta is resting. He says she'll recover fully by morning. Poirot inclined his head. That is good. She's brave, that one. Viola hesitated before sitting beside him. Do you believe someone tried to poison her? I don't think it was poison in the traditional sense, Poirot said. But something was planted there, An irritant, perhaps, or chemical residue to frighten or disable her. Viola closed her eyes briefly. All this, it feels like some ancient curse. First Thomas, now her. I fear this house will never be at peace again. Poirot turned slightly toward her. Madame, curses are the invention of those who wish to absolve themselves. But guilt is very real, and it is that which haunts this house. Viola looked into the shadows. You believe the answer lies in the Foundry, don't you? Poirot nodded. Oui, but more than that, it lies in the memories the Foundry contains. Memories sealed in its walls, its ledgers, its bells. She frowned. You think the bells store memory? He smiled. Not literally, but metaphorically. Perhaps. A bell is cast not just in bronze, but in history, in intention, in what it was meant to mark. A wedding, a warning, a war. She looked down. Then the sapphire pattern was created for remembrance, Poirot finished. Or so Eliot believed. But someone else believed it could be used for destruction. And that is what Thomas discovered. That is why he died. A knock interrupted them. Davies, the loyal groundsman, stood in the doorway wringing his cap. Begging your pardon, sir, madam, but something strange has been found at the edge of the old smelting yard. Poirot rose instantly. Show me. They followed Davies through the overgrown path behind the east wing, where rusted tools and forgotten carts lay entombed beneath nettles. The air grew colder as they reached a crumbling wall near the slag pit. Here, sir, Davies said, pointing to a pile of broken crates. I was clearing the bramble when I saw it. Half buried in the earth was a heavy iron bell, not decorative but functional, compact, rough, unlike the elegant designs of the main Foundry line. Poirot bent to examine it. Stamped on the base were the initials, SPV4. Sapphire pattern, version 4, he whispered. Beside the bell lay a rusted sealed canister. Poirot brushed away the dirt. The label had long since faded, but a faint yellow triangle remained. Chemical hazard. Viola inhaled sharply. That's military grade. Poirot turned to her. Then this was no theory. They built it, tested it, buried the evidence. Davies looked ill. Shall I fetch the constable, sir? Not yet, Poirot said. No one must know we found this. Not yet. They returned to the house under cover of dusk. Inside, Poirot sought out Colonel Harkness, who stood in the study sipping a neat scotch, his expression unreadable. You were in charge of subauditory weapons research during the war, were you not, Colonel? Poirot asked without preamble. Harkness blinked. I told you that. Poirot stepped forward. You didn't tell me you helped build the prototype buried beneath your family's land. The Colonel's glass paused halfway to his lips. That's a serious accusation. Poirot's voice was calm. No, it is a question. One you are free to answer. Harkness lowered the glass. Eliot was the visionary. I warned him, repeatedly, not to go further. But he believed memory could be weaponized, that a certain frequency could implant suggestion, even terror. And Thomas? Poirot asked. He was clever, Harkness said quietly. He started to connect the dots. Maybe he found the plans, maybe the canister. I told Edmund to intervene, to warn him off, but I didn't kill the boy. Poirot nodded slowly. Then who did? But the Colonel said nothing more. Later that evening, Poirot returned to his room. He opened his notebook and began to write. Motive, preservation or power, method, chemical, mechanical, fear, suspects, all aligned to silence. One out of guilt, one out of profit, one out of fear. He tapped his pen against the page. Beneath the words, a single thought formed. The bell did not ring to haunt them. It rang to remember them, and perhaps to reveal them. Chapter 10. The Sound That Should Not Be. The next morning broke clearer than the ones before. The heavy clouds had parted, revealing a pale, chilled sky that hung low over Stoke Lavelle like a watchful eye. But despite the sunlight glancing off the slate roofs and iron gutters, there was no warmth in the air. Poirot rose early. Before breakfast, before the household had stirred, he ventured again to the eastern slope where the buried prototype had been found. Davies had covered the bell with tarpaulin and braced the soil with timber slats as requested. The bell remained undisturbed, for now. Poirot stood before it silently, then removed one glove and touched the cool metal. He closed his eyes. A bell is meant to be struck, he thought. To call, to warn, to remember. But this one had rung without a human hand. Or had it? He returned to the house, where Lady Viola awaited him in the study, hands folded, eyes rimmed with a sleepless edge. "You were out early," she said. Poirot nodded. "Oui, madame. Sometimes the air is clearer when others are not yet breathing upon it." She offered a faint smile. "And what did the air tell you?" "That there are too many silences in this house. And silence, as I have said before, is rarely innocent." Before she could respond, the front bell rang, sharply, jarringly. A moment later, Inspector Rigby entered, his uniform damp from a long walk and a foul mood chasing behind. "I've just had a report," he said, "that someone was spotted near the old slag pit late last night. Lantern light, moving crates." Viola turned pale. "No one was meant to be near there. I ordered it sealed." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Was anything removed?" Rigby grimaced. "Too early to tell. I've posted a man to watch the site, but if someone's tampering with wartime relics, we'll have a ministry affair on our hands." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Inspector, did your man happen to notice whether the bell was still there?" "I'm told it was," Rigby replied, "but the crates beside it were disturbed." Poirot rose. "Then we must act quickly. This is no longer a matter of inheritance or rivalry. It is a matter of control. Someone is trying to rewrite the past before it is uncovered." Later that morning, Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Edmund stood stiffly by the fireplace. Jocasta sat with a blanket over her knees, pale but alert. Colonel Harkness loomed near the windows, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Lady Viola remained near Poirot, her gaze unreadable. "I must ask you all," Poirot began, "to be frank with me, for the time to withhold has passed." No one responded. He turned first to Edmund. "You were seen with a lantern on the eastern slope last night." Edmund scoffed. "Nonsense. I was in my room. Ask the servants." Poirot raised a brow. "And if I were to say a set of your muddy boot prints were found near the crates?" Edmund hesitated, then shifted. "Fine. I went down. But only to look. I'd heard what you found. I wanted to see it myself." "And did you take anything?" Poirot asked. "No," Edmund snapped. "There was nothing there for me." Poirot regarded him a moment longer, then turned to Jocasta. "Mademoiselle, do you recall anything more from your time in the archive before your collapse?" She nodded weakly. "Just that Thomas had circled a date in one of the ledgers. December 2nd, 1937. He wrote, 'The day the bell broke.'" Viola leaned forward. "Broke?" Poirot's eyes brightened. "Not physically. Metaphorically. Something failed. Or perhaps something succeeded. Too well." Colonel Harkness shifted. "That was the final test. The resonance collapsed the chamber. One of the engineers was injured. Elliot sealed the prototype that night." Poirot turned sharply. "You remember this?" The Colonel's jaw tightened. "I was there. I told you. We were pushing boundaries we didn't understand." Poirot stepped closer. "And you helped silence the consequences. You helped bury the truth." The Colonel did not deny it. Poirot paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "But the truth, mes amis, is like sound. It reverberates. It echoes. And now it has returned to us." He turned back to them. "One of you feared that truth so much you killed Thomas Cavendish. Another has tried to silence Miss Vale. And now someone has attempted to interfere with the prototype itself." He stopped. "I will find who. But I caution you all, this is no longer just about a bell. It is about what that bell means." No one spoke. Poirot inclined his head. "I ask that you remain within the estate for the next 24 hours. The next toll may be the last, and I intend to be ready for it." As he departed the room, Poirot could feel the rising storm behind every pair of eyes. The truth was near, and someone was willing to kill again to keep it buried. Chapter 11. The Chamber Beneath the Bell. Late that evening, Poirot stood in the long gallery, staring at a portrait of Elliot Cavendish Harkness. The painting was an austere one. Thick brushstrokes, a rigid stance, and cold, unblinking eyes that watched with unnerving stillness. Beneath the frame, the inscription read simply, "Vision Beyond Sound, 1936. Poirot's gaze lingered on the title, Beyond Sound. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Davies, cap in hand, face pale and unsure. "Beg pardon, sir," he said in a low voice. "I went to check the tarpaulin like you asked. The bell is still there, but someone's disturbed the soil again, and more crates are missing. I found fresh boot prints in the eastern corridor leading toward the old furnace shafts." Poirot's brow furrowed. "The furnace shafts? They were sealed." "Mostly," Davies said uneasily. "But there's one tunnel that leads beneath the Foundry's main casting floor. Wasn't used in years. Too unstable." Poirot straightened. "And yet someone risks it now. Merci, Davies. Bring a torch. We go at once." A short while later, Poirot and Davies descended through the rusted trapdoor in the east wing floor. The narrow passage beneath was lined with soot-blackened brick. The air was thick and damp, reeking of iron and time. Pipes ran overhead, some still dripping from decades-old corrosion. Poirot's footsteps echoed unnervingly in the confined space. As they moved deeper, the corridor opened into a chamber no larger than a chapel sacristy. A rusted pulley system hung from the ceiling. On the far wall was a curious panel, part brass, part ceramic, its surface etched with geometric spirals and notations, and in the centre of the room, partially collapsed and choked with debris, stood a broken pedestal. Shattered wires spilled across the stone like veins. Above it, a bronze framework hung from a rusted chain, clearly once intended to support something weighty. "This," Poirot murmured, "was the heart of it." Davies knelt beside a battered crate. "Sir, look at this." He held up a fragment of a bell, cleanly split, the interior hollow and lined with ridges. It was unlike anything crafted for ceremonial use. It resembled an instrument. Poirot took it, weighing it in his hand. They cast it down here, away from the official floor, a prototype so secret it was hidden even from its own creators. On the far wall, Poirot noticed chalk markings. He leaned closer. The writing, though faded, remained. "She remembers, but she cannot forgive." He exhaled. "Elliot, what were you trying to preserve?" A creak behind them made Poirot whirl. From the corridor, footsteps echoed again, slow, careful. Davies raised the torch. A shadow appeared. Lady Viola stepped into the dim light, her shawl clutched around her. Poirot raised a hand. "Madame, it is dangerous here." She ignored the warning. "I had to follow. I knew there was more. I remember this place. From childhood. My uncle brought me once, made me promise not to speak of it. He said it was a dream chamber." Poirot turned. "Then you were part of this after all." "I didn't understand then," she said, voice trembling. "But I do now. He wasn't building a weapon. He thought he was building something holy. He said sound could be memory, could trap it." Poirot nodded slowly. He believed the right frequency could store the essence of a moment, or a person. Viola stepped closer to the broken pedestal. "Thomas came here. I found his name carved into one of the bricks upstairs." Poirot turned sharply. "When?" 2 days before the tour," she whispered. "He must have discovered this chamber and realised what had been hidden. That's why he was silenced." Poirot looked again at the walls, at the cables, the scorched residue, the echo chamber that had never spoken. But someone had heard it, and someone had feared what it could still say. "We must leave," he said softly. "This place was sealed for a reason." They ascended in silence. Later in the study, Poirot stared at the fragment Davies had recovered. He turned it slowly in his hands, noting the precision, the terrifying beauty of its inner architecture. From the hallway, Jocasta Vale entered, walking slowly, pale but alert. "You were right," she said, "about Thomas. He'd drawn this exact design. The inner curve, the ridges. He called it the Bell of Forgetting. But I think he misunderstood." Poirot looked up. "Go on, mademoiselle." He thought it erased, but it didn't. It kept things. It recorded things. That's why Elliot kept ringing it. He was trying to preserve the voices of those he'd lost. Poirot's voice was soft. "But someone else saw its potential for something darker." Jocasta nodded. "And they didn't want us to hear what the bell had captured." Poirot's fingers closed around the bell fragment. "Then tomorrow I shall ring it." Jocasta stared at him. "You're going to activate it?" "No, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, rising. "I am going to listen. For what echoes when memory tolls." Chapter 12. The Echo That Accused. By noon the next day, a solemn hush had fallen over the Cavendish estate. Word had spread quietly among the guests. Poirot had requested that all be present in the Foundry courtyard. No details were given, only that something of importance was to be heard, something left unsaid for too long. They gathered one by one beneath the broken sky, coats buttoned against the chill. Edmund Swithinbank arrived first, jaw tight, glancing frequently at his pocket watch. Colonel Harkness followed, impassive as ever, though the slight quiver in his hand betrayed unease. Jocasta, pale but standing on her own, leaned lightly on a cane borrowed from the house staff, and Lady Viola stood near Poirot with guarded resolve, her breath visible in the cold. At the centre of the courtyard stood the recovered sapphire pattern bell, now polished clean, propped on a short stone pedestal beneath a timber beam. Davies had rigged a simple striker, a suspended mallet tied to a cord. The bell's surface, though weathered, shimmered with something other than metal. Memory, perhaps. Poirot stepped forward. His voice, though soft, carried with absolute clarity. "Mes amis," he began. "This bell was created not to signal time, nor to mark occasion, but to record, to remember. Its shape, its alloy, its vibration, all engineered with one aim, to hold something within it." No one moved. Poirot gestured to the bell. "I believe that when struck, it will emit not only a sound, but a remnant of what it once held, a fragment of the past, perhaps only a whisper, but perhaps something more." Edmund scoffed. "You expect us to believe that bronze can store words?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I expect nothing. I merely listen. And today I invite you all to do the same." With that he nodded to Davies. The groundsman stepped forward and, with a measured hand, released the striker. It swung, it struck, and the bell rang. The sound that emerged was not a chime, nor a tone. It was a tremor, deep and strange. It did not resonate in the air, but in the chest, the spine, the teeth. The courtyard seemed to shiver. And then, just beneath the frequency, came something impossible. A voice, distorted, echoing, like a voice under water, filtered through years of silence, but unmistakably human. "Mustn't let them know. She's seen the chamber. Bury it, Elliot. Bury it all." Another voice followed, urgent, fearful. "She won't stay quiet. The boy's asking questions. If he finds the shaft—" The sound cut off. Silence reigned. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, as if bowing in mourning. Then he turned. "That was not an illusion," he said softly. "That was a memory, a trace left in vibration, impossibly preserved." Jocasta clutched her coat, staring at the bell. "It was real," she whispered. "I heard it. Voices." Lady Viola looked as though she might faint. Colonel Harkness stepped back a pace. "It's a trick." "No, Colonel," Poirot said gently. "It is the truth, and I believe you recognise those voices." The Colonel remained frozen. Poirot turned his gaze to Edmund. "As did you, monsieur." Edmund opened his mouth, but no words emerged. Poirot's voice hardened. "That recording was not made last century. That was recent, a new memory, trapped in the same frequency. Someone secretly activated the bell in secret. Someone spoke into it, and in doing so, they exposed themselves." He turned slowly, facing them all. "One of you conspired to manipulate the narrative of this house, to erase inconvenient history, to remove a young man who stumbled too close to it. And when a second voice, Miss Vale, drew near, you acted again." Poirot's eyes locked on Edmund. "You told Thomas to stop digging. When he refused, you followed him. You led him to the mould room under the pretence of helping him store his findings, and when he turned to leave," Poirot struck the air with an open palm. "A crate of moulds, rigged beforehand, was tipped upon him. An accident, yes, but engineered." Edmund's face darkened. "That's ridiculous." Poirot raised a finger. "Do not lie, monsieur. The bell has already begun to speak." Poirot paced slowly, voice now firm. "You feared the Foundry's revival would expose wartime contracts, illicit experiments, scandals that could collapse your business ventures and stain the Cavendish legacy. But you underestimated one thing." He turned to Viola. Lady Viola had already chosen truth over preservation. Poirot faced the group once more. "The bell remembers, and it has named you." Edmund, lips tight, looked at the others. "You can't prove it." Poirot gave a slight bow. "Non, but the bell can." He stepped aside. And if you doubt it, strike it again, and hear what else it has preserved. But no one moved, not even the wind. And so Poirot folded his arms. He did not need to say another word. The bell had spoken, and its echo could no longer be silenced. Chapter 13. The Man Who Walked Without Sound. The aftermath of the bell's toll left the courtyard in stunned silence. No one spoke. Not Edmund, whose jaw was set so tightly his cheeks twitched. Not Colonel Harkness, whose usually impassive features betrayed the slightest flicker of alarm, and certainly not Lady Viola, who stood with one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes locked on Poirot. The detective remained composed, his hands gently folded before him as if awaiting a verdict. But he knew better than to expect an instant confession. The real unravelling of guilt, he often said, came not from confrontation, but from contradiction. As the group dispersed under the weight of what had been heard, Poirot quietly slipped away into the Foundry's archives. Jocasta, ever observant, followed him. "You believe there's more?" she said, her voice low. Poirot nodded. "Oui. What the bell offered us was not just evidence. It was an invitation to listen more closely." He moved to the back wall of the archive room where Thomas had often worked. Taped to the inner side of a filing cabinet drawer was a small note written in Thomas's hand. Recordings, hidden within frequency, archive keyhole, resonance. Bell doesn't speak, it remembers. Jocasta read it and frowned. It sounds like he discovered how to retrieve what was stored. Poirot pulled a small tuning fork from his coat pocket, an object he had borrowed from Lady Viola's late father's collection the night before. He struck it lightly on the edge of the drawer. A subtle vibration followed, faint but noticeable. Thomas must have believed the Foundry's structure acted like an amplifier, Poirot murmured, that in the right place, with the right frequency, the past would answer. They followed the vibration into the next chamber, a narrow corridor between the archive and the collapsed furnace shaft. At the centre was a small alcove, nearly indistinguishable from the soot-stained wall. Inside it, hidden behind a cracked wooden panel, was a reel-to-reel recorder. Ancient, but functional. The reels had long stopped spinning, but one tape remained loaded. Poirot brushed off the dust and opened the case. "It seems Thomas was not only investigating the past," he said. "He was documenting it." With Jocasta's help, he connected the recorder to a generator lamp rewired for low current. The machine sputtered, hummed, then whirred to life. From the speakers came a hiss, then a voice. It was Thomas. "If you're hearing this, then I've been silenced," Jocasta gasped. The bell, the one buried under the east wing, was not just a prototype. It works. Not as a weapon, but as a recorder. I've isolated fragments, conversations, some new things. Some are old. I think someone has been using it, recently. The hiss deepened. I confronted Edmund. He said I was playing with ghosts, that I didn't understand what was at stake. But he's wrong. It's he who's afraid the truth about the Foundry will destroy him. A pause. Then, "If something happens to me, ask Poirot. He'll see it. He'll hear it." The recording ended in static. Jocasta wiped a tear from her cheek. "He knew," Poirot bowed his head, "and he trusted us to finish what he began." He took the tape and secured it inside his coat. Then he turned, his expression sharp. "Come," he said. "We must return. There is still one piece of this puzzle that remains, one detail I have waited to test, and now I am ready." Back at the estate, Edmund was packing. A suitcase lay open on his bed, half filled with pressed shirts and confidential documents. He barely looked up when Poirot entered. "You've made your accusation. I suppose you think I should remain here, wait to be arrested." Poirot stepped closer, laying the tape gently on the dresser. "I do not seek arrest, monsieur," he said. "I seek the truth." Edmund snorted. "You already decided I'm guilty. Why pretend?" Poirot tilted his head. "Because the bell told me something else, a subtle detail. It captured your voice. Yes, but it captured another as well." Edmund's eyes flicked toward him, wary. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "You were not alone when Thomas was killed." The silence that followed was more telling than a confession. Poirot moved toward the door. "You have until dusk, monsieur," he said without looking back, "to tell me who helped you, and why." Then he stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. From the other side, Edmund sat still, breathing heavily. Outside, the wind picked up, but this time the bell did not ring. It waited, just as Poirot did. And it was remembered. Chapter 14. The Silent Confession. Evening descended on the Cavendish estate with an unnatural stillness. The wind, which had whispered so persistently in recent days, seemed to hold its breath. In the great hall the lights were dimmed, and shadows stretched long across the floor. The bell, now draped in canvas once more, stood in mute vigil outside. But its echo remained, buried not in metal but in conscience. Poirot stood at the window of the drawing-room, watching the long gravel path that led toward the village. He had not spoken to Edmund since the encounter in his room. He had given him time, as he often did with those whose guilt sat heavily, but had not yet broken them. Behind him, Lady Viola entered quietly, her expression a blend of worry and resignation. "Will he run?" she asked. Poirot did not turn. "No, madame, the truly guilty run before they are cornered. The half-guilt, they wait, hoping the storm passes." She crossed to the hearth and sat, her eyes flickering to the low flames. "Do you still believe Edmund killed Thomas alone?" Poirot finally turned. "No, he was complicit, yes, but not the hand that pushed. There was another, someone who has, until now, remained almost entirely in the background, until today." She frowned. "Who?" Poirot's gaze drifted toward the hallway. "I expect we shall find out soon enough." As if summoned by the words, footsteps echoed from beyond the threshold. The door creaked open, and Colonel Harkness entered. He was not in his usual pressed jacket, but in a worn wool overcoat, the collar turned up, his eyes shadowed beneath a furrowed brow. "Poirot," he said, voice flat, "I have something to say." Poirot gestured for him to sit. "By all means, mon colonel." Harkness remained standing. "It was me." Lady Viola straightened in her chair. "I killed Thomas," the colonel said. "Not intentionally, but the result is the same." Poirot nodded once, calm. "Go on." "I confronted him in the mould room. He'd sent me a message, wanted to talk about Elliot, the project, what I knew. I thought I could reason with him, tell him he'd misunderstood everything, that the past should remain buried." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "But he was angry, passionate. He accused me of being part of a cover-up, said he was going to make it all public, drag the family name through scandal. He wouldn't listen." Poirot said nothing, only listened. He turned to leave. I grabbed his arm, just to stop him, just to make him wait. But he stepped backward, tripped. The mould rack, I hadn't noticed how unstable it was. It tipped. The colonel sat, suddenly deflated. He died instantly. I stood there staring. And then I ran. Viola's voice broke the silence. "And Edmund?" "He came to me later that evening. Said Thomas had spoken to him earlier, mentioned the meeting. When he heard what happened, he didn't even flinch. Said he'd manage it. Said it was better this way." Poirot stepped forward. "And the attempt on Miss Vale?" The colonel looked away. "That was Edmund. He saw she was getting close. I told him no more violence, but he said if we didn't act, she'd unravel the whole thing." Poirot let out a slow breath. "Merci, Colonel. You have spoken the truth at last, and for that there is dignity, even in guilt." A long silence passed. The fire popped. Then Poirot added softly, "The bell preserved more than voices. It preserved consciousness, and in its echo you heard yourselves." Colonel Harkness stared into the fire. "What happens now?" Poirot turned to Lady Viola. "That depends on you, madame." She looked between the two men, one broken by grief, the other hidden by ambition. And then she stood. "I'll call Inspector Rigby. The truth must be told." Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien." As she left the room, the colonel looked at Poirot. "Do you believe in ghosts, monsieur?" Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "No, mon colonel. Only in memory, and that is a far more persistent haunting." From outside, the first toll of the village church bell rang across the estate. It was ordinary, clear, simple, but Poirot knew the real bell had already spoken, and it had named its dead. Chapter 15. The last bell cast. The following morning dawned with an eerie stillness that pressed itself against the walls of the Cavendish estate. The air hung heavy with the scent of burnt wood and damp earth, as though nature itself were holding its breath. The mist was thin now, less concealment, more revelation. Poirot stood in the courtyard once again, just as he had on that day the bell rang. But this time, it was not the bell that demanded attention, it was the silence that followed it. Inspector Rigby had arrived before sunrise, summoned discreetly by Lady Viola. Jocasta, pale but resolute, remained by her side as witness. Edmund had been confined to his room, and Colonel Harkness had surrendered quietly, with the weariness of a man relieved to set down the weight of secrets. Poirot met Rigby beneath the bare branches of the linden tree, handing over the reel-to-reel tape with care. "It is all here," Poirot said simply. "The voices, the memory, the motive." Rigby accepted it with a nod, though he looked as though he still found it hard to believe a bell had told him what the living would not. "And the girl?" he asked. "Miss Vale?" "She knew too much," Poirot said, which meant she had to be silenced. Fortunately, Monsieur Swithinbank was careless with his chemicals. Miss Vale lives, and because she lives, the truth can too. Rigby sighed, adjusting his coat. "And the Colonel? Confession or not, it will be manslaughter at the least." Poirot did not respond at once. He glanced toward the Foundry, its great rusted doors now swung wide open to the light. "He did not intend death," Poirot said at last, "but he buried the truth for too long. He allowed another man's ambition to use his silence as a weapon. And that, Inspector, is a crime far greater than an accident." Rigby nodded slowly, his gaze tracing the broken bell now wrapped in canvas once more. "I'll make the arrangements." By mid-morning the house had settled into a strange sort of quiet. Not peace, not yet, but the kind of stillness that follows the drawing of a curtain, when the performance is over and the audience begins to breathe again. Poirot sat in the library with Jocasta, who had brought him a bundle of Thomas's notes, neatly organised, now ready for the solicitor to archive. "I still can't believe he knew," she said softly. "He must have realised it days before he died. The truth was there in front of all of us, but only he had the courage to face it." Poirot looked at the pages. Sketches, formulas, phrases scrawled in hurried cursive. Memory holds in the quiet spaces. Echoes not absent. They think I won't see it, but I do. "He was brave," Poirot said, "and very nearly alone." Jocasta looked away. "You think Edmund would have killed?" "Again?" Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he answered, "Yes, not out of malice, but out of fear. The kind of fear that grows in dark corners, where truth has been locked away too long." They sat in thoughtful silence. Outside, the sound of a car pulling away signalled that the inspector had taken Edmund and Harkness into custody. Lady Viola entered the room a moment later, her expression unreadable. She crossed to Poirot and handed him a small velvet-wrapped object. "This was found in my uncle's study," she said, "hidden behind a false panel in the floorboards. I think it belongs to the story." Poirot opened it carefully. Inside lay a tuning fork. Not just any tuning fork, but a custom one, engraved with the same markings as the sapphire pattern bell. Its prongs were dulled from use. Poirot turned it over in his hands, then looked up. "It is the key," he said softly, "the precise frequency to awaken the bell." Viola exhaled, long and slow. He really believed it, didn't he? That memory could be held in sound, that grief could be preserved. "Oui, madame," Poirot said. He believed memory could be captured, and therefore controlled. But he forgot. Memory also resists. It demands to be released. She nodded, her eyes distant. "There's one more thing," she said. "I've decided to close the Foundry permanently. The revival ends here. No more secrets beneath these floors." Poirot offered a rare smile. "Then it is truly over." As the day faded and Poirot prepared to leave, he stood once more before the covered bell. He reached into his coat, drew out the tuning fork and struck it lightly against his palm. A hum resonated, not loud but deep. It rolled through the air like a whisper of thunder, and though no voice emerged this time, Poirot smiled. For he knew it was not the bell that held the truth. It was the people who finally chose to listen. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells, had simply guided them to hear what had long gone unheard. Chapter 16. Echoes. After the Silence. 3 days later, the Cavendish Bell Foundry stood still beneath a cold afternoon sun. Boards had been nailed across the east wing's warped doorways, and rusted signs warning danger, unstable structure were nailed in place. The air smelled of ash, old brass, and finality. Inside the estate, the echoes of footsteps were gentler now, as though even the walls were adjusting to their newfound honesty. A soft calm had returned, though it bore the sharp edges of the aftermath. Poirot was finishing the final touches of his report in the sunroom, seated at a carved writing desk overlooking the lawn. It was here that Jocasta Vale found him, a stack of carefully organised boxes in her arms. "These are the last of Thomas's effects," she said. "His notebooks, his field journals, the acoustic recordings he made from the lower vaults. The solicitor asked if I'd review them before they're sent to his family." Poirot accepted one of the journals, flipping it open. Thomas's handwriting was confident, though hurried, like a man trying to outrun what he'd already seen. "I heard something tonight. Not from the present, not even the recent past. A woman's voice. Not Viola, not Jocasta. Perhaps his mother?" Poirot closed the book slowly. "Even now he listens." Jocasta lowered her eyes. "I haven't slept properly since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. That first toll. It didn't feel like sound. It felt like memory pressing down from above." Poirot nodded. Perhaps it was. The weight of the unspoken. She hesitated. "Are you certain we shouldn't keep the bell?" He looked up. "I don't mean to use it," she added quickly, "but to study it, to understand what it really did. It might take years, but—" Poirot held up a hand. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "what Thomas found was not a marvel to replicate. It was a warning. That the past, if buried too deeply, does not decay. It festers. It haunts me. And if you listen too long to the ghosts, you begin to answer them." She was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, "So we let it go?" "We honour it," Poirot corrected, "by listening once, and then let it rest." From beyond the window, the sound of gravel crunching signalled the arrival of Lady Viola. She was dressed in travel attire now, muted green coat, a cloche hat, gloves buttoned neatly to the wrist. Her eyes bore the trace of someone who had made a decision, and was following through with it. "I wanted to say goodbye, Monsieur Poirot," she said, stepping inside. "Ah," he said, with a smile rising. "You're leaving?" She nodded. "The estate will be closed. Jocasta will remain temporarily to oversee the archive's relocation. After that, I go north, to Inverness. There's a quiet cottage there, with no bells." Poirot studied her carefully. "And what of your family's legacy?" She glanced toward the hearth. "What remains of it will rest. I've arranged for the bell to be sealed in a vault beneath the local museum, unlisted, unanalysed. It will not toll again." He gave a satisfied nod. "Wise?" Viola stepped closer. "I don't know how to thank you." Poirot bowed. "You need not. It is not for me. It is for Thomas, for all those whose voices were never heard until too late." Jocasta stood beside the fireplace, arms crossed lightly. "He would have been proud," she said, "to see the truth brought to light." Viola smiled faintly. "He was always too brave for his own good." Poirot picked up the final envelope on the desk, a letter addressed to Thomas's mother. With it he placed a smaller folded note, a transcription of the recording Thomas had left, the real one, unedited. "Sometimes," Poirot murmured, "truth must travel by slow post." Viola turned toward the door. "Will you stay in Stoke-Lavelle, Poirot? Rest a little?" He smiled, smoothing his moustache. "Alas, non. Rest is for others. I have a train to London this evening, and from there, perhaps Venice, or Tangier. There are many voices still calling." She paused at the threshold. "You don't believe it's over?" "For you, madame, it is. For me, I chase echoes." He held the tuning fork she had given him days before. He did not strike it. Not again. Outside, the clouds had begun to clear. The last beams of afternoon light settled on the Foundry's boarded windows, making them glint like brass once more. But no bell rang. No vibration hummed. And finally, the Cavendish Bell Foundry went still. Not silenced by fear, but by choice. And Poirot, his case closed, walked into the sun with a quiet heart, leaving memory to sleep, untroubled at last. Chapter 17. The Bellmaker's Farewell. The train to London was nearly empty. Poirot had chosen a forward-facing seat in a private compartment, as was his habit, and now sat alone with his valise, the countryside drifting past in a blur of green and slate. He did not read, he did not nap. He simply sat, his hands resting on the silver-headed cane that leaned gently against his knee. The countryside reminded him faintly of Belgium, but the stillness, it reminded him of something else entirely, of that final toll, the resonance of memory, the unburdening of secrets long held. From his coat pocket, Poirot drew a small envelope. Inside it, a fragment of parchment from one of Thomas Cavendish's recovered journals. The writing was cramped and half smeared with soot, as though the young man had scribbled it down in haste, perhaps even trembling. If sound is memory, and memory is truth, then the bell is not what speaks, it is what listens. Poirot stared at it for a long moment before folding it once more. Truth that listens, he thought. That is the heart of it. Across from him, the opposite seat sat empty, but in his mind he imagined Hastings there, warm-hearted, sceptical, likely chuckling about bells with memories and haunted metallurgy. But Poirot could almost hear him say, "Still, old man, you were right in the end, weren't you?" "Yes, mon ami," he thought with a faint smile. "We were right, but at a cost." He glanced out the window. Far off in the misty hills, the outline of a bell tower flickered in and out of view, its stone worn and leaning but still upright. And yet in Poirot's mind it did not ring, not any more. Back in Stoke-Lavelle, Lady Viola would now be boarding her coach north. Jocasta would carefully box the final records with white gloves, placing history into the hands of curators who would never fully understand what they held, and beneath the museum vault, untouched, unnamed, the bell would rest. That was enough. Poirot reached into his case, withdrawing a small notepad. On it, in neat graphite lines, he began a new title. Reflections on Resonance, the Case of the Bell That Remembered. He paused, then tapped, his pencil gently on the page. Not his most dramatic title, perhaps, but truthfully, and in the end that was what mattered. The train slowed as it approached the outskirts of the city. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, set aside the notepad, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He would take no souvenirs from the case, no bronze fragments, no preserved audio, only the memory of a young man's courage, a grieving woman's resolve, and a truth that had nearly gone unsaid. The bell had tolled, and Hercule Poirot had listened. Chapter 18. The Tone That Could Not Fade. 2 weeks later, in the quiet hush of a Bloomsbury lecture hall, a modest audience of scholars, sound engineers, and war historians gathered at the invitation of the Royal Institute of Acoustical Research. The speaker for the evening was not Hercule Poirot, as many had speculated, but Miss Jocasta Vale. She stood at the lectern in a charcoal-grey dress, a single ribbon pinned over her left shoulder, blue for memory. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear if slightly tremulous. "Tonight's lecture is not about theory. It is about something that really happened. In a village called Stoke-Lavelle, in a foundry long since shuttered, and in a bell that should never have been rung." From the shadows near the back row Poirot sat, eyes attentive, hands folded neatly on his lap. He did not speak. He did not take notes. He had come only to observe, to ensure that truth, now freed, would find its echo in the right voices. Jocasta continued. For decades, the Cavendish Bell Foundry produced ceremonial instruments of astonishing clarity, but among its last and most secretive creations was something entirely different, the sapphire pattern bell. She gestured to a projected schematic, cleaned and clarified from Thomas's original sketches. It was designed under the pretext of wartime innovation, a resonator tuned not to signal but to store, to hold memory, voice, vibration, a dangerous ambition, one that cost lives. The room shifted in its seats. Jocasta inhaled. 2 men conspired to bury its history, one out of fear, the other out of ambition. A third, the bell's creator, believed it could preserve the past for those who could no longer speak, and one young man gave his life to uncover it. She looked toward Poirot as if thanking him silently, then returned to her notes. Tonight, the sapphire bell is silent. It has been sealed, forever, not destroyed, not forgotten, but placed where it can no longer be used as a weapon of silence. There was a long pause, then quietly, "We do not need it to remember. We only need the courage to listen, to each other, and to ourselves." A ripple of applause followed, quiet, respectful. Poirot allowed himself a small nod, not for the speech, but for the final note it struck. After the lecture, Castor found him outside beneath the gas lamps, her coat bundled against the breeze. "You stayed?" "Naturellement," Poirot replied. "I'm not so vain as to need applause, but I do enjoy an encore, when it is earned." She smiled. "It's over now, isn't it?" Poirot glanced toward the stars. "No, not over. The past never ends, mademoiselle. It only fades, until someone listens again." She understood. She always had. He offered her his arm, and they walked a short way through the quiet London street, the sounds of the city muffled beneath autumn's approach. "Will you return to detective work soon?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But for now, I shall rest my little grey cells. They have been working quite hard lately." She laughed. "That they have." And so, with lanterns flickering above and no tolling bells to haunt the air, Poirot bid her good night. Alone again, he stepped into the darkness with polished shoes and a quiet heart. The case of the ancient bell foundry had ended not with an arrest or a public scandal, but with understanding. And that for Hercule Poirot was justice enough, for some crimes echoed, but others were absorbed, and it was in the silence after truth that peace, at last, could ring.